Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Margolis with Turner Classic Movies. I hope you're having an amazing festival so far. And welcome to our presentation of Assisting the Classics. Before we get started, we have a great conversation for you today, but I have a few quick announcements. As always, please silence your cell phone. We'd like to give a big thank you to Citi, our official card of the film festival. And then I just wanted to let everyone know that our TBAs have been announced. So please, this is for tomorrow, look at the film festival app and you'll find all the details there for the titles that will be screened. So now I'd like to give a warm welcome to our TCM host and author of 3 books on women in film. So please welcome the fabulous Alicia Malone.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to see you all here. This was a panel I put my hand up for because I love hearing stories from people who knew the stars that we all love. This is Assisting the Classics. And something that I find really interesting and we consider a lot at TCM is how to continue the legacy of the stars in the films and the people who made the films long after they have passed. And one way to do that is through stories, especially stories from people who knew them intimately. So we have 3 people who worked very, very closely with some of your favorite stars and a favorite director, and I would like to introduce them each to you. First, we have Jody Eisenstein-Miracle, who worked with Jerry Stiller and Anne Meara for many years. Richard Stanley, who was a close personal friend and assistant to George Cukor. And Steve Stoliar, who was a fan of Groucho Marx and then ended up being with him in the latter part of his life. Steve. Thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to hear your stories. But first, I just want to ask the most obvious question, which is how you got this job and how you met the stars. So first off, Jody, you were at a comedy roast for Jerry Stiller?
Yes, actually, I had produced his roast with a man named Ken Greengrass, who was a personal manager for many people, including Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet. And so we were producing the roast, and then after the roast, I got to know Jerry and his another longtime assistant, Dawn Eaton, and basically begged him to hire me because we were at a point where there were no more roasts to be done by this particular man. So that's how it started.
And not only did you get to work with Jerry Stiller, but also the legendary Anne Meara, and these two obviously
Yes.
had a very long and loving marriage and a lot of differences between them and
Yes.
a lot of love between them.
Yes.
Tell us how they met, because that's a really interesting story.
Well, that's a story that Jerry liked to tell frequently, and Anne would interrupt him during that story and always say, "Oh, Jerry, you're making it up, you're making it up." But basically what it was they met in an agent's office when they were doing the rounds, what you would do during the 50s, and this particular agent, Jerry was with another person who he wanted to make his comedy partner, but they didn't have the chemistry. And then Anne walked in, and she was this beautiful, tall, redheaded woman, and he immediately fell in love with her and ditched the other woman. And he went in, Anne went in first to the agent's office, and she came out crying. This is what Jerry says. And he said, "What's wrong? What happened?" And she said, "Well, he chased me around the room. I didn't know what I was doing. He chased me around the room." And so he got a little upset, and he went in, and he said, "What are you doing, chasing that young woman around the room?" And he said, "Well, now it's your turn. I'm going to chase you around the room." So this is the story that Jerry tells. I don't know if it's true. And then he left and asked her out for coffee. And they went out to coffee at Langley's cafeteria. If anyone's a New Yorker, you know that cafeteria. And he said that she stole the silverware while they were having their first date because she needed silverware for her apartment in the Village. So that was their first date.
I love that story. And Richard, take us back to a a balmy summer evening in 1977. How did you meet George Cukor?
I knew at that time in 1977, I was a writer, photographer, magazine editor, and I had done a story on Jamie Herlihy, who wrote Midnight Cowboy. And Jamie called me up and said he liked the interview and would I mind coming to dinner. So a few days later he called me and he said, would you mind picking up one of my guests who doesn't drive any longer? And I said, no, not at all. He lives over near you and his name is George Cukor. And I'm thinking to myself, George Cukor? I thought he was dead. So I drive over to Cordell Drive, go up to his house, and I'm thinking, there was a little phone, you push the button, the door buzzed, I opened it. I thought I was going into the house, and instead I was just going into the garden. And up at the top of the stairs was George, and his first words to me were, how about a drink? And I said, well, I don't really know whether we have time. We've got to get to Silver Lake. And he said, well, yes, you're right. So I get him down. And at that time, I had a gold 64 Eldorado convertible. It was a beautiful summer night with the top down. And I looked at him and I thought, let's get him in the car and put that top up. He's not going to. So I start the engine and he hears the whir of the motor. And he says, no, 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 I love an open car. So I thought, okay, so we drive down to the strip, turn left, and there in this beautiful glow, I'm thinking to myself, I better not have an accident with this Academy Award winner in the front seat. And suddenly, I'm holding the wheel, and suddenly this finger and hand dart across, marvelous, marvelous. And I'm thinking, what is it? And I look over at the, not the Whiskey A Go-Go, I guess it was, and there was a whole line of the most beautiful blonde surfers lined up to get in there, and I'm looking at the surfers, and I'm looking at this, as he would say, elderly gent, and I'm going back and forth, and I'm just thinking, this is the oldest gay man I've ever met.
And how did it come to be that he, asked you to be his travel companion and part-time assistant?
Well, George was 78 when I met him. I was 27, and he needed, I'd worked for Air France, I knew a little of the travel industry and so on, and he needed someone who could be a lieutenant and sort of give him this sort of smooth passage from A to B. And he was getting a lot of invitations at that time of his life to go to London and Asia even. And so he just needed someone who could smooth the way for him. And I was that person. You could never have dropped George off at LAX and expect him to get on a plane to London alone. It just wasn't going to happen. In fact, we got thrown off a few planes.
We'll have to come back to that and find out more about those stories. But Steve, you were not just a fan of Groucho Marx, but you said upstairs a fanatic, and he was sort of very elusive to you because he was a figure around LA, but you didn't get to meet him for a little while.
I was sure I would never get to meet him. I was certain of it because he was already in his 80s and in ill health. And I had been a Groucho fanatic, really an obsessive fan before it was fashionable, but I didn't want to marry him or murder him. I just wanted to shake his hand and thank him for duck soup. And I would get all of these reports from people saying, oh, I was walking along a park, Santa Monica near Rodeo, and there was Groucho in his little beret, and I would think, should I camp out there? Do I bring a sleeping bag? And then a friend of mine and I went to a pizzeria in Beverly Hills called Jacopo's, and they had a Groucho special on the menu, and I thought, well, you can go to Nate and Al's Delicatessen, and they have an Eddie Cantor, but he's been dead for years. So I said to the waitress, does Groucho Marx really come in here? And she said, oh, yes, he was in, let me see, yesterday. And he always comes in right after we open, and he always tries to pay with a $100 bill, and he knows I can't make change. He's so funny. And I wanted to strangle her, and I wanted to say, why is Groucho wasted on this waitress instead of his #1 fan? There was, and still is, a motion picture called Animal Crackers that hadn't been seen in decades. And it had been made at Paramount in 1930, and then when MCA Universal bought the old Paramount films in the late 50s, it was included in that package. However, basically because of a clerical error, the rights to the film, the copyright had expired and reverted to the authors and composers of the original play, George Kaufman, Maury Riskind, hold your applause till the end, Bert Kalmer and Harry Ruby. And Universal didn't think there was any point in spending good money to bring out a 1930 Marx Brothers movie, because they had, you know, Airport 75 to worry about, the classics that they were. And all my friends and I wanted to see this movie, and I came up with the idea. I was a history student at UCLA, of starting up a petition drive and to put pressure on Universal to show them that there were people that wanted to see this old movie that hadn't been in theaters in decades, hadn't been shown on television. And I was able to get in touch with Erin Fleming, who was the young actress who had started as Groucho's secretary but became his manager and really in charge of his life towards the end. And so she and I would have phone calls talking about the Animal Crackers campaign. And one time I said, "How's Groucho?" And she said, "Here." And I hear, "Hello?" And I said, Hi, Groucho, how are you doing?" And he said, "How am I doing what?" I said, "How are you doing whatever you're doing?" And he said, "I'm telephoning. How are you? What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm telephoning too. It certainly is a small world." And then he said, "All right, I'll let you speak it with my secretary, Miss Fleming." And, you know, my heart was pounding, but I had gotten to talk to Groucho, so I'm getting closer. And there was a day when she brought Groucho to UCLA. We had a table on Bruin Walk. There were all these petition tables that for gay rights and ending the war and legalizing marijuana and the Hare Krishnas, and then this table of people trying to get an old Marx Brothers movie re-released. Groucho came to UCLA, and I said, "Groucho, I am very happy to be meeting you after all this time." And he said, "Well, you should be." And Erin said, "This is Steve Stoliar. He's the one who's trying to get Animal Crackers re-released." And Groucho said, "Well, did you get it?" And I said, "No, but we're working on it." And he said, "Well, you better or I'll fire you." And I said, "I didn't realize I was working for you. How much are you paying me?" And he said, "A little less than nothing." And we were off and running, and my heart was pounding out of my chest. There was such a crush of students hanging on his every word, because he had a sort of whispery voice toward the end. I remember some kid yelling out, "I can't hear you." And Groucho said, "You're very fortunate." And one of the reporters said, "Mr. Marx, what is the purpose of your meeting, of your appearance here today?" "I expect to get lunch." And she said, "No, but I mean beyond that." "I may get dinner." So we talked, and it's like there we were gabbing away, and I'm like pinching myself if this is happening. And, they're talking, "What do you think of what the young people are doing and they're being fans of the Marx Brothers after all these years?" And Groucho said, "Well, I'm very flattered by it." He said, "Last Halloween, there were 3 kids that came to my door dressed as Harpo and Chico and Groucho." And I said, "What did you give them?" And he said, "I sent for the police." So Universal didn't like being embarrassed by this kid and his friends, and they relented and cleared the rights to bring the movie out. And they figured they would bring it out at the UA Westwood and have a premiere in New York also, and that was it, and they didn't want to hear about it. And it ended up breaking the house record at the UA Westwood that had been set by the press, excuse me, never buy your teeth in the mail, by French Connection several years earlier. And it was, you know, beyond gratifying to be able to see there on the marquee, the 4 Marx Brothers and animal crackers, and a long line of guys in tennis shoes and T-shirts and blue jeans showing Universal that people did care about old movies back then. And I had a few summer jobs fall through that year, 74, for which I remain eternally grateful. And I thought, well, I have nothing left to lose, and I really don't want to lose this connection. So I called Erin Fleming, and I said, is there anything at all that you think I might be able to do? She said, well, actually, we need someone to handle Groucho's fan mail, which has gotten quite big because of all the interest in the Marx Brothers. And we need someone who really knows their Marx Brothers to handle and organize all of his memorabilia that's going to be donated to the Smithsonian. And I'm thinking, please, 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 oh God, oh God, please, please, please. And in my mind's eye, it's like a Tex Avery cartoon where she's still on the phone talking to me and I'm on the front door knocking. And I thought, I have died and gone to heaven, because it was at his house, and I was there for the last 3 years of his life. That's the short version of the answer to your question.
I could listen to it all day. I mean, it's so interesting to hear all of the various tasks that each of you did. You know, you weren't just, as we think of personal assistants today, but you had a variety of jobs. And Jody, I know one of the things you got to do was help run lines with Jerry and Anne, who had different ways of memorizing.
Yes, they were very different in their approach to their work. Anne would just have me highlight all of her lines, and then she'd say, leave me alone, I've got to, you know, I'm learning my lines. You know, so that was, she would do one and done for Anne. She was just very sharp. And Jerry, on the other hand, he would take hours learning everything. He would make little notes on the sides of his scripts. He would put paper clips on every single page. And he actually also had a little mini tape recorder, and he would speak the lines to himself constantly. And they were both so brilliant in the end as the result, but the process was just so different. And at the end of Jerry's life, actually, Anne passed in 2015, and he passed in 2020. He and I would spend a lot of time together, and he would still, even at the end of his life when he was not feeling so well, he would know every line to a lot of the sketches. And I was actually very honored. I would do one of the Sullivan sketches with him called the Hate Sketch, which I don't know if anybody knows it. It starts out, you know, I hate you more. I've hated you 2 years. I hate you 4 years. You know, and it would culminate into like, I hate Columbus for discovering America and making me hate you the way I hate you right now. So, you know, he was actually, you know, he was not moving very much at that point in his life, but he knew every single line. And after we did the whole sketch, I was just like, Jerry, I am so happy I just did that with you. You don't even know. And he's like, you were better than Anne. And I'm like, no, I wasn't. He lied. He lied. He would, that's another part of him. He would make you feel like you were the most important person in the room, wherever he went. You know, he would make an effort to just, you know, shake your head. It would take forever to get him out the door, which was one of Anne and his shtick. You know, he would be like, wait a minute, I got to say hello to Jerry, hurry it up. I'm leaving without you. You know, and everybody just loved having them in a room together because it would become a constant act. You know? Yeah,
and they loved saying like thank you notes, but it could go on forever.
Yeah, one person in particular kept writing a thank you for they gave gifts to everybody. I mean, we would spend hours at Christmas time, you know, every single person on the Seinfeld cast, every single person in King of Queens, they would get anything. You know, at one point, a broken cookie jar, you know, it's like, let's use that. Send it to somebody in props, they won't know. I'm like, no. But these people would thank them, and then Anne and Jerry would write back a thank you for their thank you, and it went on for like, some of these people got like 3 thank yous from them. But yeah, they were very considerate in that way.
And Richard, what did you note about George Cukor and the way that he related to people as you traveled with him?
Well, George was very magnanimous with people. Ironically, he resented not being recognized in Los Angeles. We would go out for dinner and nobody knew him, and yet people would stand in the snow waiting for an autograph on a book or something in London or Paris. And people in China would know. One time we were Deborah Raffin and her husband Michael Wiener and George and I went to China, and we were out in the boondocks at a restaurant for dinner, and Deborah was a B picture actress in China, here maybe, but in China she was an A actress, and she was very well known. And the guide told us that the waiter and the waitress recognized Deborah, and they made a big fuss over Deborah. And George was sitting there, thought it was very polite. He adored Deborah. And finally, at one point, he looked at the Chinese waiter and waitress and said, me, George Cukor. And they looked like, huh? And we all just, dissolved in laughter. But he wished he had more recognition, I think, in the United States. He was kind of forgotten by the time I knew him, for the most part, except outside the country.
Even in Hollywood?
Even in Hollywood. Very few people recognized him. The only time he would always get recognized would be in the elevator of the Academy Theater when we'd go in for a screening. And there would be people like Ruben Mamoulian or King Vidor or whatever. But when outside, he was pretty well forgotten at the end.
And Steve, you got to meet some amazing people through your work with Groucho. What stands out for you?
It was a dizzying experience. Well, as I mentioned, I was a real fanatic to begin with, so I knew who all these people were that were coming through the door. You may have had the experience where when you're younger, you meet someone, and then when you're older, you think, oh man, I wish I'd known, I would have asked them this. But in my case, as each person would come in, my mental Rolodex, gee, Grandpa, what's that? Would flip to the card, and it's like, oh, there's Nat Perrin. He co-wrote Monkey Business and Duck Soup. There's Irv Brecker. He wrote At the Circus. And I got to meet S.J. Perelman, who, in addition to working on Monkey Business and Horse Feathers, was one of the premier humorists of the 20th century, 20 volumes of books made up of his pieces for The New Yorker. I got to meet Mae West. I got to meet George Burns. I got to meet Bob Hope. I got to meet Jack Lemmon, Steve Allen, and Dick Cavett. And because I was on the inside, they assumed that I must have some reason for being there. So there was never an attitude thing like you might have if a fan came up to someone famous out in public. So they didn't know if I worked there or if I was Groucho's grandson or something. But, and it was a very egalitarian household. I was always welcome at the lunch table. It wasn't like the help eats in the kitchen or anything like that. And I know when George Burns came over, this was before the Sunshine Boys, before that whole renaissance of his career. But again, because I was crazy about old movies and old comedians, I knew him from Burns and Allen on radio and the Paramount films and television and all that. So I was a little nervous. The doorbell rang and I answered it, and this little man looked up at me and he said, "Hi, you want to live a long time? Become an actor. You'll live to be an old man like Groucho and me. Okay, let's eat." And there we were, having lunch with Groucho on Hillcrest Road.
And the thing about you being a genuine fan is that you knew the importance of writing down all these stories and keeping track of everything that Groucho said. Still very witty, even though he was old.
Yes. There was, he had had strokes and was in his mid-80s and had the hardening of the arteries. But there was so much to begin with that even after the health problems, he was still Groucho. He used to he would look forward to, I'd bring him a clump of mail each day, and he subscribed to the trade papers to keep up with what was happening in Hollywood. And he sat down at the table one day and he said, "Wonderful mail you brought me, nothing but requests for money." And I said, "Well, but you got a variety, didn't you?" And he said, "Yes, a variety of requests for money." So it's like, wow, and they're paying me to sit here and listen to that. So he would say things, and I would race down the hall to my office in his house, and I would scribble on pieces of paper, so-and-so said this, red button said this, so-and-so. And I still have this yellowing clump of scrap paper in a rusty paper clip in my closet. And, you know, those were some of the jigsaw puzzle pieces that I used when I was putting my book, Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House, together. So my memory was pretty good to begin with, but it was great having these contemporaneous reminders, and also friends of mine who I would come home from working for Groucho and zip a piece of paper in the typewriter and say, "Here's a conversation from today," and mail it to a friend of mine. The ones that kept copies, I was able to use that, and so a lot of these Grouchoisms in the book would have been lost had it not been for my obsessive-compulsive nature. So.
Yeah, because a lot of these stories would never be told without people like you three retelling them. You know, Jody, tell us about Jerry Stiller and Seinfeld, because he, you know, that's a part that he became very famous for, Frank
Yes.
Costanza.
Frank Costanza, yeah. You might be able to Google this and hear him telling this story, because he told this story a lot. He was not the first choice for that character, actually. It started out to be John Randolph, the actor John Randolph, and they weren't happy with John Randolph's kind of chemistry with Estelle Harris, so they called Jerry, and at the time he was doing Three Men on a Horse with Tony Randall and Jack Klugman on Broadway, and he turned it down. He said, "What's Seinfeld?" You know, he had no idea what it was because he didn't watch television that often. But anyhow, so he did this Broadway show, and they were really wanting him for this part. So, you know, Larry David tried again, you know, tried a second time, and his agent said, "Well, go out and just, you know, read the part, because they really want you to, you know, see what you're like." So when he went out there, Larry David told him to play it down, you know, just because Estelle was very high and screaming all the time. He said, "You got to play like milquetoast. It'll be really a good, you know, sort of energy between the two of you." And so he started doing it. It just felt wrong to him, you know. So she started screaming. She's like, "You're the one who ruined his life. You're the one who slept with him in bed. You're the," whatever she, you know, Estelle said. And then he's like, then he started screaming higher. He said, "You're the one who did this. You're the one who..." And so Larry David everybody was cracking up on the set of Seinfeld, and Larry David said, "Keep it that way." So that was his story, and then that he only did really 20-some episodes of that show, which went on for 9 years, but he became iconic for that character. It really raised his career, so.
I always think of Serenity Now.
Yes.
I was saying earlier, Serenity Now. It doesn't work if it's downplayed.
My sister had that put on a T-shirt. It resonated.
Serenity Now.
Serenity Now.
And then on the back it should say Insanity later. So Richard, you also, you know, the keeper of great stories. One that I would love to hear about is it true that you got to attend one of Cukor's last famous pool parties?
Well, yes. One of the very last. I knew George toward the end of his career in life, and the pool. After that first evening together, driving back and forth with the top down across Los Angeles, he said, "Why don't you come over Sunday afternoon?" And so I did, and I went swimming. That pool, by the way, had no heater. And the pool was bearable to me only at the very end of the summer. It was incredible. But Kate Hepburn, every morning, all year long, 7 a.m., she was in that swimming pool, no matter how cold that water was. Wow. But in any event, I did, I've lost my train of thought now.
The pool party.
The pool party, the last pool party, it was crazy because I was standing there with a towel around my shoulders and just in a wetsuit, and George said to Bruce Grega, "Take Richard through the house." And so I'm walking through his oval room, which was one of the great rooms of Hollywood, where everybody who was anybody sat with George and conversed, and I was suddenly realizing that I was walking on a finer tabletop than I had ever dined upon. And it was mild. It was nothing like in Gods and Monsters, nothing at all like that. That was a complete baloney interpretation of what George's pool parties were. And there were never people walking around disrobed. It was elegant, like everything in George's house.
And like George himself.
And like George himself. He was the most refined, witty, charming guy who could flip sometimes, but he was incredible. I miss him. He was my mentor. He changed my life, to be sure.
And Steve, I know, Groucho changed your life a lot as well, but it wasn't always fun and games inside the house. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think about the end of The Wizard of Oz. Spoiler alert. I think when I think that, some of it wasn't very nice, but most of it was beautiful. And it really was, walking through the door, it was as if my life went from sepia to Technicolor. And I was, the downside of getting close to your hero when he's in his last days is having a front row center seat to his fading out and the curtain coming down. But there were so many false scares that I learned that don't count them out just yet. I mean, a few weeks into my working there, I had just gotten comfortable working there and not being nervous around him, and I rang the bell, and the maid answered, and she said, "Please be quiet, Mr. Marx has had a stroke, and the nurse is asking for you to come into his bedroom." And I thought, oh man, the coach is turning back into a pumpkin and the horses into mice. But it was a great few weeks. And I go walking, and I expect to see him lying motionless, unable to speak, and he's propped up in bed reading the paper with his mucklucks on and his pajamas. "Is the ambulance here yet?" "No." "Figures." And the nurse wanted me to help him. He had to go to the bathroom, and he needed some assistance because he was slumping to one side. And I mean, it struck me. It was like, here is this man that I've adored for years, and now he's so vulnerable that he needs my help, and I'm happy to be here to give it. And then the other dark side, in addition to Groucho's mortality, was dealing with the mercurial Erin Fleming, who, I try to avoid cliches like the plague at all costs. I try to avoid cliches, but the setup of a formerly strong, vibrant man going for a young woman towards the end of his life and alienating the longtime friends and family happened to John Barrymore. It happened to Bela Lugosi. It was a common theme, and that's what happened with Erin Fleming. And the older Groucho got, the more he relied on her. And she was literally mentally unbalanced. She was later diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. And she was on any number of prescribed and recreational drugs. This was the mid-70s. And so you never knew what Erin was going to be coming through the door. We would figure it out by how hard she slammed the door and threw her keys in the silver dish. And I have no idea how I managed to hang on to my job because she hired and fired, you know, the Queen and Alice off with their heads. And I had had no experience working with volatile personalities before. My childhood, our family was very middle of the road. There was no cussing, no screaming, no slamming of doors, none of that. And here's this woman who's just a volcano, and you couldn't second guess her. There would be something that would happen and you'd think, oh man, when Erin hears about this, she's gonna have a shit fit. And she would hear about it and she'd go, oh yes, that's just Sydney, of course. And then something else you thought was completely innocuous, she would just become Cruella de Vil. And it was, you know, it was a difficult tightrope act for those of us that were in the house and cared about him, because he was so fond of her and he was so reliant on her, even though her fits would send his blood pressure dangerously high. And, you know, she made his last days rockier than they deserved to have been. But she was also devoted to him at a time when his family had other priorities. So one of the themes in the book was a phrase that I learned that André Gide said, the color of truth is gray. And as I've gotten older, I found that to be repeatedly true about a lot of things. People are rarely the hero, the villain. But somehow I managed to stay on her good side, and even was in charge. I was even in charge of the household towards the end, when there was a big dust-up, a big legal battle between Groucho's son Arthur and Erin over control of Groucho. And so I was in a position of having to tell her, I think it's time you have to leave now. And she would be on the phone saying, fucking servants are treating me like a cockroach. But I wrote it out till the end because the man I loved was down the hall, fading out. So it was, but as Dorothy said, most of it was beautiful. I mean, getting close to all these people that I admired from afar. And you know, you mentioned changing my life. I started as a history major, but I could not resist the pull of entertainment. I always had like a flair for turning amusing phrases till tonight. But I didn't think there was any career to be had, as if being a history major was my shortcut to having solid gold eating utensils. But I switched to motion picture television, and when I cornered S.J. Perelman at Groucho's house, he advised me to be a playwright because they have more control over the material. Television is the producer's medium, film the director's medium. And I asked if he would sign a copy of his latest book, which he had me leave at the Chateau Marmont, and I would call for it when it was ready. And he wrote to Steve Stoliar with very cordial wishes for his ultimate success as a writer. And I thought, well, I have no choice, because if I become a plumber, someone will say, well, who is this that he says you should be? So.
And Jody, you know, it seems like it also changed your life. The work you do now is with elderly people. Was that inspired by being with Jerry during his last years?
Yes, a little bit. I mean, what do you do after you spend 21 years with two people? And you know, Jerry passed, and there was a year in which we archived a lot of his stuff, and it's actually being, some of it's being collected at a comedy museum in Jamestown, New York, you know, his collection, their collection, so there should be a display at some point of the two of them. But I was finding, and I loved entertainment. I was a performer. I started as a performer and then, you know, moved into this position as a personal assistant. But I found that I had sort of a niche for handling older people at a time in their lives that's very vulnerable. And there's a gap somewhere in, I think, in our world today where people want to still be independent and they don't need nursing care, but they want to be on their own, but there's a technology gap and there's all kinds of gaps. And I sort of have formed a business helping individuals do that. I go into their homes and I make sure that they know how to like make a plane reservation. I mean, as simple as something that I know how to do, they struggle with. And so that's, yeah, I mean, that's how that started. So.
And what was it like for you to be with Jerry during those last years?
Well, I was with both of them when they passed. Anne, very different. She had tragic, she had a devastating stroke, which put her in a nursing home for 2.5 years, but she was very well cared for, and she passed of natural causes eventually. He was very different. He stayed at home, and with a slow decline, but he was still very much who he always was. It was, you have a lot of company come in, and we would go out. They were big Upper West Siders, and they brought their children. I'm like getting a little choked up about this because it's hard to talk about, but they brought their children up on the Upper West Side, so he would spend many days going to his favorite restaurants with us. We would accompany him everywhere. And I say us because he had caregivers as well, and seeing him, we became a family. I became very much part of his family, and when you lose an employer and a friend like that, as you both know, it can be devastating because it's not only your job, but it's this emotional loss. So I don't know where I was going with that, but just he taught me, I guess. It was quite an experience to see that, and I'm hoping to spread that to other people who might not be as famous, so to speak. But so.
And Richard, you said that George Cukor was your mentor. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, he liked people who could track with him, and there weren't very many people of my generation that he knew that could track with him. I was the only person that I knew that could correct his grammar. He corrected mine, and before I knew it was wrong, but before I could correct myself, he would correct me. But even though he did not go to college, he was, I think, almost a valedictorian of his high school, which was DeWitt Clinton High School in New York. And by the way, this just calls to mind, years later after George died, I was at a pool party, and there was older gentleman there with DeWitt Clinton High School on his t-shirt. And I said, oh, I know somebody who went to DeWitt Clinton, George Cukor. And he looked at me and beamed, and he said, our English teacher brought me out. And I thought, okay. Because George was, it was an open secret that he was gay. Nobody really talked about it, but those who knew. He made me feel very comfortable being a gay man, and at his house, when that door closed and you were in that garden, and by the way, if you want to see what George's house looked like, watch the Something's Gotta Give set was reused for another picture, and you would know it. I can't remember the Doris Day, James Garner picture.
Move Over Darling?
Move Over Darling, thank you. And that
10 points to Steve.
We'll make a good team.
Okay.
But anyway, that set, George was in pre-production with the crew, and they met at George's house, and they needed to think of an exterior set that they could use to shoot Marilyn Monroe, because they knew that she would be completely unreliable in an exterior, because they would never be able to match action and so on. So George just said, well, why don't we just use my house? So they photographed George's house and recreated it line for line on a soundstage. And that year, he always had very witty Christmas cards that George Huney, his good friend who was a photographer, fashion photographer, made that showed a picture of George seemingly leaning on the rail of the handrail out of his swimming pool, but when you lifted up the flap, It was the rigging of the sound stage, so it was George's house in the sound stage. But I asked George one time, speaking of Marilyn, he was very, very punctual. I learned never be late. If you were a minute late at 6:30 for dinner, he would start cursing. And he figured that if he's kind enough to invite you to dinner and his cook is talented enough to time the dinner to 7 p.m., that you damn well better be there on time out of respect. So, but anyway, he was saying that I was talking about Marilyn with him one time, and I said, you know, George, you directed all those divas who were habitually, interminably late. How did you ever, you're so punctual, how did you ever get on with them? And he sort of bowed his head a little, and he sort of jumped up and he said, they just can't help it. He recognized that, and he had to, you know, Judy Garland, Elizabeth Taylor, Ava Gardner, on and on and on. They just can't help it. But for Friends, you helped it.
Yeah.
You
Had to be there on time. And Steve, your book is actually being made into a movie,
What?
which is pretty incredible. Yes.
Oh my God!
Can you tell us about that?
Well, yes. In fact, you know, even as I was writing it, I was thinking that there's aspects of sort of my favorite year, and even Sunset Boulevard, and then later Ed Wood, the idea of this kid and his aging hero, and all. And it is, in fact, in pre-production. The director and co-screenwriter is a man named Oren Moverman, who did that Brian Wilson biography and was Oscar nominated for The Messenger with Woody Harrelson, and he's a great fellow. We have Mr. Jeffrey Rush playing the elderly Groucho, and he is from Australia.
Whoop, whoop.
Now, not Austria, that's near Germany. It's Australia, which, as you know, is an annex of Tasmania. There is a young actor named, okay, you'd have to be a young actor, because you probably saw some of the pictures of me when I was in my Chad Everett period with mutton chops. Charlie Plummer is his name. He was the young Getty in All the Money in the World, and the director, Oren, has worked with him before. And I would say we look enough alike to be neighbors. That if you have a picture of me at 20 next to a picture of him now, they're uncannily dissimilar. But it doesn't matter, because he has the chops, and only my sisters and my cousins are going to say, Steve wasn't that tall. I don't know. And as the volatile Erin Fleming, who seems to be sent from heaven to look after Groucho, but has dark undertones, Sienna Miller is going to be playing her. And we are currently working on getting it fully funded. We had a chance to start last year with a really streamlined, stripped down budget, and it was a tough decision, because it's like I have one chance to trade in my cow for magic beans, and it's like, no, I want it done as it deserves to be done, or not at all. So, but everybody is on board, and we hope to be filming it later this year, and it will blow what's left of my mind to walk onto the set of a film that's meant to recreate a house I spent the better part of 3 years of my life in, reenacting scenes that I lived with people playing people I knew, including someone playing me.
Based on your book.
Based on my book.
I mean, it's amazing.
So I don't know how. Do we have time for my Zeppo story?
Do you want to hear a Zeppo story? I think the answer here is
Ben
yes.
Mankiewicz said, be sure to tell this, because that crowd will love it. Because there's endless Groucho stories, but I got Zeppo, and I knew Gummo as well, the fifth brother. But I was dating a young lady named Linda at the time that I was in college, and I brought her to dinner at Groucho's on a night that Zeppo had come up from Palm Springs. And Zeppo kind of picked up where Chico left off in terms of being a skirt chaser, flirt. His last wife had recently left him, trading up for Frank Sinatra, Barbara. And Zeppo really was, he seemed far younger than his 74 years. He lit up a room when he walked in. He had a great sense of humor. And he really took a liking to Linda. And he said, Steve, you know, you and Linda ought to visit me in Palm Springs sometime. And I said, well, I don't know, Zeppo. I was there when I was a kid, and it was sweltering. And he said, well, when were you there, in the summertime? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, Steve, you know, it's cold in Alaska during the winter, too. So she and I broke up, and I got a couple of photos I wanted him to sign. So I sent them to him, and my cover letter said, Linda and I aren't seeing each other anymore, so I know you've been around the block a few times. Do you have any advice for the lovelorn? My phone rings. Steve, Zeppo Marx, how are you? Fine. Listen, I got your letter and the photos, and I signed them. God, I was good looking back then. Listen, do you think that Linda would go out with me? And now, I don't want to step on your toes. You understand that? Because that's the last thing in the world I'd want to do. So if this is at all uncomfortable, I said, no, she enjoyed meeting you. And I'm thinking, he's hitting on my ex. And I said, let me ask her, because I want to make sure this is fine with you, Steve, because I don't want to step on your toes. So I mentioned it to Linda, and she too kind of got a kick out of it and thought, you know, this is an interesting experience. So they went out once. He took her to lunch in San Diego and then to attend a Highlight game in Tijuana. So I guess that was Zeppo's first date, dinner in San Diego and a Highlight game. And he says, Steve, I want you to know I didn't even kiss her goodnight. She's very nice, but all she did was talk about herself. And then I saw Linda on campus. I said, how was your date? And she said, he was very nice, but all he did was talk about himself. And after that, whenever I would be at a party at Groucho's and Zeppo was there, he'd make a point of pulling me over and introducing me to someone and saying, this is Steve. He's a nice fella. He and I dated the same girl. But he got further with her than I did. So she was 19, I was 20, and he was 74.
Hollywood. I want to get to some audience questions. So yes, put up your hand. And we have roving microphones.
I see a headless coming. John Travolta has his hand
Yeah, he does. He just has one question. Just one.
That's all he needs.
First, I want to say that, you hear that?
Yeah.
First, I want to say that I really enjoyed all three of you. You tell great stories. Great storytellers, Alicia. You're as the orchestrator, the conductor, fantastic. Now I forgot the question.
That was nice.
Jody,
Yes.
I wanted to ask you. Now I'm sure probably almost everybody here knows, but I don't know. So Anne Meara and Jerry Stiller, you know, back in the 60s and so on, they're famous for being on the Ed Sullivan Show and doing their act. And how do they meet? Did they marry first? Or they had their act first? If you can relate that.
This was they met before they started working on that act. But that was, Jerry had that in mind from the very beginning. She did not want to be a comedian. She wanted to be like a serious actress. But obviously, she was very, very funny. So, no, they started dating and they were married 6 months later in 1953. So, and then they did a lot. They actually were they did a lot of Shakespearean work, in the park, Shakespeare in the Park for a while, and then started working on the act, and they were doing the clubs, and a producer discovered them, and then they started doing Sullivan, and that's what brought them to fame at that time.
She was very good. She had a talent for comedy.
Yes.
Hi, this question is for Richard. I'm a big George Cukor fan, and I hope this question is not too trite, but I'm wondering if he ever shared with you which were his favorite film accomplishments and which were his regrets.
Well, I think he definitely regretted what happened to A Star is Born. I personally think that's his masterpiece. He never mentioned Jack Warner's name without prefacing that name with, "That son of a bitch, Jack Warner." He never forgave Jack Warner for chopping up the film behind my back, as he would say. When he was in, he used to say India, he was actually in Pakistan doing Bwani Junction. He did, you know, one of the things that Steve and I were talking about earlier is that we didn't have the benefit, knowing the folks that we knew then, that we do now with TCM and the internet and all of that. I wish I knew what I knew now back then, because I could have asked so many more things. But George didn't talk about pictures. He owned one print of one picture that ABC Circle Films just sort of gave him, and that was Love Among the Ruins. He never watched his old pictures. I had to drag him to a double feature of Dinner at 8 and The Women at the Vista Theater one night, because he didn't think his films were funny any longer. So, and we stepped into the lobby and propped open the door to the theater a little bit and heard the roar of the crowd, and he said to me, "They're laughing, they're laughing." I said, "Well, George, there's some pretty funny lines in there." And then we sat down and George started doing this to me when we were watching The Women, and pointing up at the screen and saying, "That's funny." And I said, "Well, George, you directed it." But I don't think he had a favorite picture. And there was one that he regretted that he and Kate Hepburn did for Pan Berman, called Sylvia Scarlett. And he said that Kate Hepburn went into the ladies' room during the preview, which was in Riverside or somewhere, and there was a woman in the ladies' room back like this, sort of howling or moaning, and Kate walked in and said to her, "That bad, huh?" And so, but when they got back to Hollywood, they had Pandro Berman come over to George's house, and as George would tell the story, they backed him up against the wall and they said, "Pan, kill this picture, we'll do another one for you for nothing." And anyway, George was very bemused that it had later become a kind of cult classic, Sylvia Scarlett.
Quite ahead of its time as well. Have another question?
This sort of relates. I assume George Cukor and Groucho Marx had real home theaters in their homes. No? I was going to ask what movies you remember both of them watching in the 70s. Like, did Groucho Marx like Woody Allen or Mel Brooks movies? Or did George Cukor watch any of the new musicals that were coming out, like Grease or maybe Tommy or something like that?
We never watched a picture in George's house together. I can't remember. I heard that the night he died, he had a heart attack, he was watching The Graduate.
Groucho had a den and had a screening room. He didn't tend to watch his films. He didn't have a big film library, but he did enjoy watching his films on TV. And when You Bet Your Life was resyndicated, even if he was having a party, he would look at his watch and he would say, "Well, my show is on." And he'd shuffle down the hall and start watching TV. And I remember one lunch he came to the table and he was kind of in a sour mood. And he just said, "Whatever made Eddie Bezell think he could be a director?" And he had been watching either Go West or At the Circus, but it's like that was 1939 or 40, but he had just been watching it and reinforcing his his spot-on perception that it was not one of their better movies, but it was as if he had just come from the set. Whatever made Eddie Bazell think he could direct the picture. Groucho loved Woody Allen and was sort of an avuncular figure, giving him advice in his stand-up days. He did like Mel Brooks. As a matter of fact, at the re-premiere of Animal Crackers, Carl Reiner and Groucho were sitting behind me, and Carl was asking Groucho if he had seen Blazing Saddles. And Groucho said, "That scene around the campfire was something." And Carl Reiner said, "Well, that's what happens when you eat a lot of beans and drink a lot of coffee." And Groucho said, "You fart." And Reiner said, "Exactly."
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but ending on that note, right? But Steve, Richard, and Jody have said that if you would like to talk with them more, you can do so out in the lobby where they'll be if you have more questions. But please thank Steve Stoliar, Richard Stanley, Jody Eisenstein-Miracle.
Thank you.
No, I don't know how you play. You breaks me with your cold shoulder. Well,